Thanksgiving is right around the corner, and so today we're going to tackle making a pumpkin pie from scratch on the Kamado Joe Classic 2. There are a handful of shortcuts that we can take to make this an easier and cheaper recipe, like buying a pre-made pie dough or canned pumpkin puree, but in an effort to keep things as homemade as possible, it's worth trying to make some of these ingredients ourselves, at least once. There are three main parts to this recipe: the pumpkin, which we're going to have to roast, the crust, and the filling. So we're going to start with a pumpkin. We're going to be using a white pumpkin today, which some say could end up being a bit creamier than its orange sugar pumpkin sister, but the flesh of the pumpkin still ends up being like a shade of orange underneath this ivory skin on the outside. We'll go get the grill ready first, adding enough lump charcoal to keep us at roasting temperatures. This should be enough, and we'll get this started with a fire starter and go start working on our pumpkin. We're going to slice this pumpkin in half to roast it on the Kamado Joe. First, we're going to remove the stem. We don't need that. Now we'll cut this pumpkin horizontally so we have a shallower half to roast off. If this were a more round pumpkin, we could just cut it vertically. Make sure you have a sharp knife for this step. We're going to scrape all of this out, leaving behind the flesh. If you want to keep those seeds, you can, but I'm just going to toss them. Checking back on the grill, we're looking to get the dome temperature around 400 degrees, after which we will install our heat deflectors and allow the dome temperature to rise to 425. We're going to place the halves of the pumpkins flesh side down with some parchment paper on a cookie sheet and put it on the grill to roast off for about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the size of your pumpkin. After this time, we can use a knife or a toothpick to puncture the skin to see if the flesh is well roasted through. There should be no resistance here. You're looking for almost the consistency of butter. If that's the case, it's time to remove these and peel the skin off so we can start to process the flesh into a puree. Using a pair of gloves, preferably with cottons underneath them, since this is going to be very hot, begin by peeling the skin back, flipping over to remove the crusty flesh on the other side. We don't want that in our puree. It'll make it a little bit more bitter. We'll add the flesh to a food processor and mix it until there are no chunks. So give it a stir once in a while, make sure everything's getting evenly pureed. One thing I do not show here is after pureeing this, I actually drain some of the excess liquid from this by using a fine mesh sieve. You can also use a cheesecloth, but we want to remove as much of the excess moisture as possible, especially if we're going to be freezing this for later use. So it looks like this 2-pound pumpkin yielded 1 pound and 5 ounces of puree, which should be enough for our pie filling. Now you can freeze this for up to 3 months if you don't plan on using it in the next week. Otherwise, place it in an airtight container and store it in the refrigerator. Now that our puree is done, we're going to move on to making our pie dough. We're going to add 28 ounces of pastry flour, 4.5 ounces of sugar, 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt, and 4.5 sticks of butter that we have cubed up and frozen. Now, this butter was fresh out of the freezer, and when we started mixing this, you can see the butter did not have much give, and it actually threw some flour out of the mixing bowl. So I'd recommend letting the butter sit for maybe 3 to 5 minutes before you start mixing it in if you're going to freeze it beforehand. So we're just going to leave this on the lowest stir setting with the paddle attachment until the chunks of butter break down into these smaller pea-sized bits. Once that's done, we'll incorporate 4 eggs, one at a time. And this should tighten up the dough a bit. My mixer was actually on the struggle bus and stopped being able to fully turn after I added the 4th egg. The last ingredient is just 3 tablespoons of cold water. Give that a quick mix if your mixer allows, and we're done. We'll turn this out onto a floured surface to shape it into about 1 to 2 inch thick square or rectangle. We can wrap this in plastic wrap and store it in the fridge for at least 30 minutes to firm up before we want to roll it out. This will make about 3 pies worth, so you can store the remainder in the freezer for later use. But if you're going to thaw it, make sure you give it about a day or 2 to thaw in the refrigerator. Now we can unwrap our portion of our pie dough. Be sure to flour your work surface. I made that mistake, and flour your rolling pin if you need to as well. We're trying to roll this out so that it will fit our pie pan with some excess on the outside. Time for the part that made me think, never again will I attempt to make my own pie dough. We're going to roll this out up onto a rolling pin, and you can see how sticky this dough is. After rolling it onto the work surface, it was clear I had not floured it up enough, so use a bench scraper or spatula or any tool you can use to prevent this from happening, or just flour your work surface better than I did. Once we've succeeded in rolling the pie dough around the rolling pin, despite our best efforts to fail miserably, we can transfer it to our pie plate that we have sprayed with some vegetable oil or spray butter. And as you can see, unfurling the pie dough was also an error-prone task. It looks pretty awful right here, but resist the urge to completely start over. This pie dough is very forgiving. Lift up the edges of the dough and push some into the pie pan to allow it to really get down in there. Make any requisite repairs to the dough by adding some extra pieces, and then we'll add a decorative crimp to the edge of the pie to finish this up. There, not perfect, but it will get the job done, and it will look fine after it's been cooked. Now we're going to blind bake the crust. Now before we start doing this, we've got to get the Kamado dough back up to 375 degrees with the deflector plates in place in preparation for this blind baking. This will prevent the bottom of the pie crust from getting soggy from the filling and leave us with a really nice dark brown crust in our end product. So ball up a piece of parchment paper and fill it with your pie weight of choice. You can use some dried beans or granulated sugar. I'm going to use some rice for this one. After we have our crust ready, we can place it on the grill and allow it to bake for 20 to 30 minutes, or until you notice a decent browning on the edge of the crust. After removing from the grill, we'll adjust the temperature down to 325 degrees. We can discard our pie weights or keep them for future cooks. Just don't try to use these as an ingredient in anything. And while the bottom of this pie crust is hot off the grill, we're going to brush on a thin layer of egg white, which will further prevent a soggy pie. At long last, it's time to mix up our pie filling. So we're going to start with 2 cups of our pumpkin puree. Turns out our pumpkin yielded that exact amount. I got pretty lucky there. 1 cup of heavy cream, half cup of maple syrup, half cup of brown sugar, 3 eggs lightly beaten, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, 1 teaspoon of ground cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of kosher salt, 1/4 teaspoon of ground nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon of ground cloves, 1/2 teaspoon of ground ginger, and 1/4 teaspoon of ground cardamom. I did not have any cardamom, so I just added a little bit more ginger. Time to give this all a stir, mixing everything until we have something that smells like pumpkin pie. Pour the filling into the pie crust. And if you have a little bit too much, that's fine. Don't feel the need to overfill the pie. Our grill is maintaining its temperature around 325, so we are going to put this pie on the grill and let it bake for about 30 minutes before we check it. After about 30 minutes, we can see that the edges are starting to set a bit. It's gained a darker brown hue, but this pie still has about an hour to go, so we're going to close this back up and check on it in another 30 minutes. So nearly an hour in, the pie is looking pretty good. The crust is not getting too dark too fast, and the center of the pie filling is no longer liquid, but still has some jiggle to it. We can also temp the center of this filling. We're going to look for a temperature of 175 degrees. Once we've reached that temperature, we can remove the pie from the grill and let it rest at room temperature for about 2 hours before we're going to place it in the fridge to fully set for a few more hours. And now for the moment of truth. I messed the top up a little bit because I attempted to put plastic wrap on top of it, but nevertheless, this pie looks and smells like it should. But we need to make our topping. I'm mixing in a half cup of heavy cream with about a tablespoon of sugar and a splash of bourbon. You can sub out bourbon for vanilla extract as well. Now time to whisk this until we form stiff peaks. This may take a few minutes. A hand or stand mixer would work too. Once we've achieved our desired consistency, it's time to cut ourselves a slice of homemade pie. Don't worry if the edge of the crust does not make it onto your pie plate intact. Place a dollop of whipped cream on top and enjoy. Now, I love pumpkin pie, and I am accustomed to the $5 pies that you can get at the grocery store, so it doesn't take much to please me, but this definitely set a new bar for me. This pie wasn't too sweet, and it had a lighter color than that typical bright orange that you see, but I think that's just because we used a white pumpkin for this one. The crust turned out great and is really the only part of the pie that has some grill flavor, as my wife calls it. Overall, this is an involved but delicious recipe. All the effort aside, though, I do recommend trying to create a homemade pie for your family this holiday season. So cheers to you and yours, and happy grilling.